It didn't happen in a courtroom. There was no spotlight, no pulpit, no roaring crowd demanding truth, just a quiet room, a single light, and a man in a worn collar, folding his hands one last time. He did not speak with rage. His voice didn't tremble with guilt. He wasn't there to accuse, he was there to reveal. His name won't be remembered, not by the church, not by the world, but his words. They linger, because some confessions are not for absolution, they are for awakening. He has spent 40 years inside the silence, inside the structure, inside the rituals that bound flesh to faith and truth to permission. He had seen things he was told not to see, read things he was told not to understand, and slowly, quietly, he began to ask the question no priest is ever meant to ask. What are we hiding, not just from the world, but from ourselves? He described the vaults, the archives, the long corridors beneath Rome where time is stacked like stone, where pages breathe in dust, and names fade into Latin silence. He spoke of texts never seen by the public, of letters written by saints. That sounded less like miracles and more like men searching in the dark. He spoke of teachings that contradicted the canon, of gospels that sang a different song, of stories that centered not on power, but on presence, on light within. He said the truth was never buried, it was shelved, catalogued, tied with ribbon and stored under lock and prayer, not to protect it from decay, but to protect the world from remembering what it once knew. And then he leaned in, closer, as if to make sure no one else could hear. The church, he said, is not afraid of sin. It is afraid of awakening. Because an awakened soul asks questions, seeks truth beyond ritual, looks not to the altar, but to the mirror. And that is the one thing that cannot be controlled. He never claimed to have all the answers, but he had enough to know that answers were being kept, not out of malice, but out of design. A structure built not just to guide, but to contain. His final words were not bitter, they were soft. God is not the secret, he said. It's the silence around him that they work so hard to protect. And with that, he stood, folded his collar one last time, and walked out. Not from faith, but from the version he was no longer willing to defend. Somewhere in the archives his files were erased, his name redacted, his story sealed. But this is the confession they never wanted you to hear. And it was never meant to save your soul, only to set it free. It looks like a church. Marble columns, chiseled saints frozen in holy defiance, fountains that flow like memory itself. Pilgrims gather, tourists marvel, photographers aim, all of them staring up at what they believe is the heart of faith. But the Vatican is not just a church, it is a kingdom, one with borders, guards, and its own flag, a sovereign city-state, the smallest country in the world, but perhaps the most powerful. Within its walls, laws bend to different rules, crimes are judged by different courts, secrets are guarded not just by locks but by oaths. It is both sanctuary and fortress, a palace of whispers, a treasury of time. And unlike any other kingdom, its power is not measured in land but in loyalty. Nearly 1 billion souls look to it as the center of divine authority, yet few truly see what lies behind its sacred facade. The Swiss Guard stands at attention, bright uniforms, ancient weapons, but their presence isn't pageantry, it's protection, because inside those walls are not just relics and rosaries, there are vaults, rooms with no windows, corridors that lead nowhere, unless you have the right name, the right clearance, the right silence. The Vatican owns property around the world. It runs embassies, negotiates with governments, and its finances, while cloaked in divine mission, move like any powerful institution. Gold has passed through these halls, article land, and sometimes things that cannot be named. Even its map is deceptive. What you see above, St. Peter's, the Apostolic Palace, the square, is only part of the story. Beneath the surface there's another city, one of tunnels, of archives, of sealed doors and undocumented spaces. Priests walk in silence. Monks carry trays of parchment older than nations. It is a world unto itself, self-contained, self-regulating, immune to intrusion. The Vatican even has its own post office, its own passport system, its own diplomatic immunity. So when you step into the square, you're not just entering a place of prayer, you're crossing into a sovereign realm, one that answers only to itself. This is not criticism, it's architecture. By design, the Vatican is impenetrable, not just physically, but ideologically. It is both fortress and filter. What passes through its gates is transformed, sanctified, sanitized, and what never leaves is what you're not supposed to know. Because behind the walls of God's kingdom lies a structure far older than most empires, far quieter than most powers, and far more practiced at hiding what it cannot explain. Not to deceive, but to preserve, or at least that's what they'll tell you. But when a kingdom wears robes instead of crowns, it doesn't become less powerful, only harder to question. The statue stands at the edge of the square, massive, solemn, unblinking. Saint Peter, carved in stone, holding 2 keys in his hand, 1 gold, 1 silver. Tourists walk past without a glance. Pilgrims bow their heads, but few ever ask what those keys truly mean. Because they're not just symbols, they're declarations, and they unlock more than gates. According to Scripture, Christ gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose will be loosed. A divine authority handed not just to a man, but to a system. The Church claims that power still flows from that moment, from Peter to Pope to present day. The keys were never just for entry, they were for control. And over time they've come to represent something even deeper. The authority to define sin, to forgive it, to name what is sacred and what is not. But here's what's rarely said. If you hold the keys, you also decide what doors stay closed. You decide which gospels are canon, which voices are remembered, which truths are binding. And once a truth is locked away, few dare to ask why. That power has shaped centuries. Empires bowed before it. Kings sought its blessing. Wars were waged not with swords, but with doctrines written in Latin. The Church became not just a guide to the soul, but a gatekeeper of reality. Because to say we have the keys is to say we decide what's real. And when you believe that, you stop looking for your own doors. You wait to be let in, or left out. The gold key symbolizes divine authority, the silver, but earthly governance. Together they bind heaven to earth, a bridge between the visible and the hidden. But ask yourself, who decides what's on the other side? Who decides what's forbidden, what's forgotten, what's untouchable? And who guards the door when the one holding the keys no longer answers to the world, but only to itself? The ex-priest who spoke out said he once believed in the keys, until he realized they weren't being used to unlock understanding, but to protect it from scrutiny. The keys didn't open heaven, they closed history, they locked up questions, and they taught generations that doubt was danger, so the faithful obeyed, not out of fear, but out of trust. That someone wiser held the keys. But now, we ask the question he dared to ask. What if the keys aren't to the kingdom above, but to the vault below? What if they don't open truth, but silence? And what happens when those who once trusted decide to pick the lock? Beneath the grandeur, beneath the marble saints and golden domes, beneath the echo of choirs that seem to stretch through time, there is silence. Not ordinary silence, a curated one, a silence so dense it feels like velvet drawn across memory. They call it the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It used to be called the Secret Archive, until the word secret made people uncomfortable. So they changed the name, but not the rules, not the locks. 85 kilometers of shelving, more than 35,000 volumes. And yet, most of the world will never see a single page. It's not a library, it's not a museum, it's not open to the public. To enter you need permission, not curiosity, not even credentials. You need approval from the Church itself. You must name what you're looking for before you ever set foot inside. And if you don't know what's there, you're not likely to be let in. It's a paradox. You cannot search unless you already know what you're meant to find. Inside those shelves, history is not told, it is kept. Papal letters from the Middle Ages, kings pleading for annulments, scientists begging not to be condemned, documents that never reach the light, manuscripts that contradict official stories, journals from saints who doubted, from popes who feared. And then there are the things we don't know, catalogues that were never made public, rooms behind locked doors that even scholars whisper about, documents whose contents are sealed for centuries, sometimes indefinitely. Why? Because some truths disrupt more than they illuminate. They challenge structures. They question the divine timeline. They suggest that history, as we know it, was not just lived, but edited. The ex-priest called the archive a cemetery of knowledge, not because the documents are dead, but because no one is allowed to speak their names aloud. He said there were maps that shouldn't exist, writings that described machines centuries ahead of their time, letters between popes and rulers that hinted at alliances never acknowledged. He described rows of parchment sealed in glass, their Latin faded, their meanings clearer than the church would ever admit. But he couldn't show us. He had seen them, but not copied them. He had touched them, but not kept them. Because even those granted access are watched, every step, every note, every glance. The Vatican says it is protecting the sacred, preserving history. But what if it's doing more than that? What if it's protecting power? What if it's guarding a version of the past that would unravel everything if opened too wide? Some doors remain shut not because they cannot be opened, but because those who hold the keys have decided the world isn't ready. Or worse, that the world should never know. Beneath the polished floors of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the prayers, the hymns, the endless echo of reverence, there is another world. Few who walk the marble nave know what lies below their feet. They see light, but never the dark that supports it. Because under the Vatican there are layers, not just of history, but of burial, of secrecy, of whisper. They call it the necropolis, the city of the dead. It stretches beneath the altar, a maze of ancient tombs and passages where time stands still and names have long worn away. It's not open to the public, not really. A few small groups are permitted each year, guided, timed, watched. But what lies beyond the tour path is not discussed. And there are rumours of sealed chambers, of inscriptions never translated, of relics too controversial to display. Some claim there are vaults that predate Christianity itself, temples buried and reconsecrated, altars erased and rebuilt, layer upon layer of faith stacked atop forgotten gods, and at the centre of it all, the bones. St. Peter, also they say, discovered in the 1940s, kept hidden, then slowly, selectively revealed. Fragments of a man buried beneath where millions now kneel, but even his identity is debated. The church claims certainty, but the inscriptions, the evidence, they ask more questions than they answer. Still, the symbolism is powerful. The first pope, beneath the throne of the current one, a continuity carved in stone. But what else lies there beneath that sacred foundation? Some say old scrolls were buried with the early saints, texts not burned but sealed, to be kept from heresy or perhaps to be used later. Others believe there are hidden doors within the necropolis, leading to deeper chambers, older ruins. A pre-Christian past the Vatican has never admitted. And then there are the whispers of rituals performed in private, of relics too powerful to name, of knowledge locked away because its presence alone would break the spell that keeps the faithful looking upward instead of inward. The ex-priest said he had once descended without permission, only once. What he saw he wouldn't describe. Only this. There are things buried there that would change everything if they were brought into the light. But light doesn't reach where it isn't allowed. And down there, in the cold, among the bones and silence, the past remains untouched. Not because it can't be uncovered, but because it serves its purpose exactly where it is. Beneath, hidden, sanctified. Where truth becomes relic and a relic becomes myth, and the myth becomes the foundation of a kingdom. There are shelves we're not meant to browse, pages we were never meant to turn, ideas so dangerous the church didn't just disagree with them, It declared them forbidden, not debated, not challenged, silenced. They called it the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. For over 400 years, it was the official list of works banned by the Catholic Church, not because they lied, but because they threatened. Some questioned doctrine, some revealed ancient wisdom, some dared to suggest that truth didn't need to be sanctioned to be real. The index wasn't a warning, it was a wall. Once a book appeared on it, it vanished from libraries, from schools, from the hands of the curious. Authors were branded heretics, printers excommunicated, ideas buried, sometimes literally. Copernicus made the list, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, whose thoughts on infinite worlds burned with him in a Roman square. But it wasn't just science that was targeted, mysticism, alternative gospels, books of ancient philosophy translated from Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew, banned for offering truths outside the church's grasp, even novels, even poetry. If a line suggested that salvation might be found without a priest, without a ritual, it was labelled poison, and like poison it had to be contained. The ex-priest said the index wasn't just a list, it was a signal to scholars, to rulers, to the faithful. It told them where not to look, what not to ask, who not to believe. But behind closed doors, the church kept the very books it forbade, copies stored in the Vatican library, studied in silence, marked, translated, dissected, but never released. Because knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, is still power. And you don't throw away power, you just keep it for yourself. Today the index is no longer enforced, at least not officially. It was abolished in 1966. But the spirit of it still lingers. There are still texts the church does not endorse, still subjects it discourages, still silences it won't break. And there are books that simply never made it back, whole philosophies that disappeared when labelled heretical, whole movements reduced to footnotes. And once something is erased from collective memory, it doesn't need to be burned, it just needs to be forgotten. That's the real power of the index, not censorship, but erasure, a shaping of what humanity is allowed to remember, and a quiet reminder that the greatest threat to any institution built on authority is not rebellion. It's a well-placed question buried in a forbidden book read by someone who refuses to stop thinking, even when told not to. They are not monks in the traditional sense. They do not live in isolation. They do not wear robes of silence. They walk among governments, universities, science labs, and sometimes war rooms. They are the Society of Jesus. But most know them by another name, Jesuits. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, they were born during a time of chaos, a time when the church was cracking, Protestants rising, truth splintering in every direction. The Jesuits didn't just defend the church, they rebuilt its intellectual fortress. They were scholars, educators, missionaries with minds sharper than any sword. They travelled the world not just to convert, but to observe, to learn, to absorb other cultures and bring that knowledge back. China, India, South America. They studied languages, astronomy, mathematics. They debated with Confucian scholars, mapped stars with Islamic astronomers. They became experts in everything because knowledge itself was their battlefield. But not all knowledge was shared. The ex-priest called them the keepers of the threshold. Not because they stood between good and evil, but because they stood between the people and the truth. He said the Jesuits were trained not just in theology, but in tactics, psychology, control, to teach without revealing, to lead without being seen, to win the war of ideas before the battle even begins. Their oath, he whispered, was unlike any other. It pledged allegiance not just to God, but to the Pope, absolute, unquestioned. They became the church's elite, its shadow diplomats, its mental architects. Some say they saved the church from collapse. Others say they reshaped it into something new and far more powerful. They opened schools, wrote textbooks, taught emperors, advised kings. But the deeper you look, the more the line blurs. What do they actually believe? Where does devotion end and strategy begin? Because the Jesuits don't worship in the open. They observe, they file, They remember, they serve God, but not always in ways the faithful would recognize. And they guard, that much is certain, ancient texts, cosmic theories, philosophical contradictions that could unravel centuries of doctrine, locked behind layers of approval, hidden in academic language so dense few can penetrate it. They do not burn books, they write around them, absorb them, redefine them, until the original message is swallowed whole. The Jesuit code is not written on parchment, it is lived, taught, passed hand to hand in ideas, in questions, in the long game. And while the Vatican speaks in absolutes, the Jesuits speak in nuance. They believe in control through complexity, because the more complex something becomes, the fewer who can understand it, and the fewer who understand, the easier it is to decide what they are allowed to know or believe. He wears no crown, no gold, no crimson robes trailing behind him. He walks in black, moves in silence, answers to no kingdom, except the one within the walls of the Vatican. They call him the Black Pope, not for his skin, not for his soul, but for the shadow he casts in a place already dim with secrets. His real title is the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, but titles are veils, and this one hides more than it reveals. Officially, he commands the Jesuits, an order of priests dedicated to education, intellect, missionary work. Unofficially, he's the subject of whispers. They say his power rivals the Pope himself, that he sits behind the throne, advising, correcting, sometimes overruling. Some say he is the Pope's conscience, others say he's the one pulling the strings. And unlike the white-robed pontiff, he is not elected by the cardinals. He is chosen from within, unseen, unvoted, unquestioned. His authority stretches quietly, in every direction, across continents, through Jesuit schools, missions, advisory boards. He shapes minds before they ever realize who taught them. The ex-priest said he met the Black Pope once, only once, in a room with no windows, no cameras, just a crucifix, a desk, and a voice that spoke softly and carried weight like a cathedral stone. He said the man knew things he could not have known, answered questions before they were asked, and when the conversation ended he felt lighter, but less certain of who he was. Because the Black Pope, he claimed, was not there to lead worship. He was there to guard the architecture of belief, to ensure that the shape of the church remained intact, even as its substance shifted. Some claim the title is misunderstood, that conspiracy theories have made him larger than life. But what's more dangerous? A myth created from fear, or a truth buried beneath it? Because power that wears robes and speaks from balconies is easy to trace, but power that walks unseen through the corridors of doctrine, through the minds of world leaders, through libraries of the forbidden, that kind of power is harder to name. And perhaps that's the point. The Black Pope has no throne, no parade, no songs sung in his name, but his reach extends farther than most will ever know. Not by force, not by spectacle, but by intellect, by network, by silence. Because in a world obsessed with crowns, it's easy to miss the one who chooses who wears them. And in a church that preaches light, he is the shadow that keeps it from burning too bright, not to extinguish, but to control. Because sometimes what guides faith isn't what you see, it's who you never do. The stars were not supposed to lie, but one man looked up and saw something that shattered the heavens as the church had drawn them. His name was Galileo Galilei, mathematician, astronomer, a man who dared to say what others only whispered, that Earth was not the center, that it moved, spun, danced in a great celestial rhythm with other planets around the sun. It wasn't a theory, he had seen it. Through a telescope he built with his own hands, he watched the moons of Jupiter orbiting a world other than ours. Proof, etched in motion, but the sky, as drawn by scripture, didn't allow for movement, didn't allow for man to be anything but central. To question the heavens was to question the word of God. And so the church responded not with curiosity, but with silence, then with threat. Then, with trial, Galileo was summoned to Rome. He stood before the Inquisition, not as a heretic in flames, but as a scholar made small. They demanded he recant, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and being right was dangerous. So he did. With clenched jaw and eyes full of defiance, he recanted. He said the earth stood still, said the sun circled us, said what they told him to say, but as he turned away he is rumoured to have whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, because truth doesn't need permission to be true. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest. His books were banned, his name branded with caution. He didn't die in fire, he died in silence. A silence engineered by power, cloaked in theology. The church eventually admitted its mistake. Centuries later, long after the damage was done, long after the stars had confirmed what he knew. But apologies cannot rewrite the silence. They cannot unmake the fear that stifled 100 other voices who chose not to speak because they saw what happened to the man who did. The ex-priest said the lesson of Galileo was not about science or sin, it was about control. Because if the heavens could move, so could the ground beneath doctrine, so could the people, so could the faith. And that was the real danger. Not a spinning earth, but a spinning mind. One that could no longer be held in place. Galileo looked through a lens and saw freedom. The church looked back and saw a threat. And so they chose silence. Because sometimes when the truth is too loud, those in power simply cover their ears. High above Rome, nestled behind ancient walls, the Vatican owns something that seems at first glance out of place. Not a chapel, not a library, but an observatory, a telescope, a quiet eye turned to the heavens, and not just one, they've had many. One of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world sits under the Vatican's watchful gaze, founded centuries ago, upgraded, expanded, even relocated to Arizona to escape light pollution. But why? Why does a religious institution invest so heavily in watching the stars? Some say it's symbolic, a gesture of unity between faith and science, that the Church, having once silenced Galileo, now seeks redemption by seeking knowledge. But others are not so sure. The ex-priest said the observatories were not just about science, they were about continuity. Because the sky never forgets. It holds records older than scripture, patterns more precise than any doctrine, calendars carved in light, and maps. Maps to stories the church has never told. He claimed some within the Vatican believe the heavens hold more than stars. They hold messages, prophecies, warnings perhaps. Not all visible to the naked eye, not all meant for public understanding. Why else would the Vatican fund spectrographs, infrared sensors, high-powered lenses far beyond what the average theologian requires? And why are their findings so rarely shared? The Vatican Observatory has hosted conferences with scientists from all over the world. Astronomers, astrophysicists, even cosmologists who study the birth of time itself. But the public hears little of what's discussed, what's agreed upon, what's questioned. Because when faith watches the stars, it does so differently, not to name constellations, but to trace the line between the seen and the sacred. Some say the church is preparing for a revelation, for a discovery that could shake its foundation. Perhaps it already has. There are rumours of classified research, of celestial alignments tied not to astronomy but to prophecy. Some point to ancient texts locked in the archives that speak of messengers from the sky, of beings not angelic, not human, but something in between. And if those messages return, who will translate them? Who will control their meaning? The Vatican has long known that the greatest power is not in seeing, but in deciding what others are allowed to see. So while the telescope points upward, the questions fall downward. What are they watching? What are they waiting for? And when the sky finally speaks, will we hear it for ourselves? Or will the message pass through marble halls, Latin tongues, and filtered light before we're ever told what was truly seen? There is a place in the Vatican where silence gathers like dust. It stretches wall to wall, shelf to shelf, volume to volume. A library, but not one you can wander. No cozy chairs, no whispers between visitors, no curious fingers tracing old bindings. Because this library was never built for the people, it was built for preservation and control. The Vatican Library holds one of the richest collections of human thought ever assembled. Manuscripts from Babylon, scrolls from Egypt, letters from emperors, writings in languages long extinct, a map of human memory folded and bound, hidden behind marble walls. There are over 1 million books, thousands of incunabula, books printed before 1501, texts hand-copied by monks who didn't always understand what they were preserving. And yet, very little of it is seen. To enter, you must request access. You must name your purpose. You must know what you're asking to see before you've ever seen it. And even then, there are limits. Sections cordoned off, texts too fragile, too sacred, or too dangerous to leave their vaults. What kind of knowledge needs that much protection? The ex-priest said it wasn't just about fragility, it was about fear, fear of contradiction, fear of revelation, fear that certain texts might awaken questions better left unasked. There are documents from early Christianity that tell a different story, of teachings that never made it into the Bible. There are writings from other faiths, philosophies that challenge the Church's foundation, wisdom once called heresy, but now simply forgotten. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. He claimed the Church kept it all, not to erase it, but to contain it, to have it, just in case. Because knowledge is like fire, it can warm, it can enlighten, but left unchecked, it can burn. So the Vatican holds the matches, not as tyrants, but as stewards, at least that's the story. But who decides what's too powerful to be read, too ancient to be understood, too sacred for public eyes? And when entire civilizations are remembered only through the ink of these locked-up pages, what happens if the doors never open? The library waits, stone floors cool to the touch, pages resting in the dark. A world of memory held in place not by chains but by silence. Not lost, not gone, just unread. And perhaps that's the most dangerous kind of forgetting. The kind where truth isn't missing, it's just waiting for someone to ask for it. And to be allowed to hear the answer. It began in 1962. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. Peter's Basilica, bishops from every corner of the world gathered in solemn procession. Over 2,000 voices draped in white and crimson assembled not to debate doctrine, but to redefine it. They called it the Second Vatican Council, or simply Vatican II, a meeting meant to modernize, to open windows, to let fresh air into an ancient institution, and on the surface it did. The Latin Mass gave way to vernacular. Priests now faced the people, laity were invited to participate, not just observe. The Church declared a new tone, one of openness, dialogue, engagement with the modern world. But beneath the applause and polished speeches, something else stirred, because change that deep always has shadows. The ex-priest said the council didn't just rewrite rituals, it redacted history. Certain traditions were quietly erased, symbols removed, feasts forgotten. Doctrinal language softened, blurred at the edges, until ancient boundaries became suggestions. And not all bishops agreed. Many feared the changes went too far. Others whispered they hadn't gone far enough. In back rooms, away from the cameras, decisions were made about what to reveal and what to bury. Documents circulated only among the highest levels. Drafts of declarations that never reached the floor. Ideas too radical, too dangerous, too revealing. One proposal reportedly discussed was a re-examination of the Church's stance on extraterrestrial life. Another, a quiet revisiting of the apocryphal Gospels, long thought lost but never truly gone. None of that reached the public, none of it made the final documents. Instead, a new face of Catholicism was offered, gentler, simpler, stripped of many of its older mysteries, and with it, a quiet forgetting. Altars were dismantled, relics relocated, some saints simply vanished. What was never spoken aloud again were the questions that surfaced during those 4 intense years. What if the church had been wrong about more than just language? What if certain teachings had been cultural, not divine? What if the very structure of salvation was not as rigid as once believed? But those questions were not given voice. They were acknowledged, then shelved, filed away like so many ancient manuscripts, kept but never revisited. The world saw a church transformed, but inside many felt unmoored. Because when a building shifts its foundation, the cracks do not always show on the surface. They echo beneath the stone. And Vatican too, for all its light, cast a long shadow, one filled with what-ifs, unfinished thoughts, and truths that were almost allowed to breathe. Almost. She was there, at the foot of the cross, at the tomb, in the garden when the stone was rolled away. Mary Magdalene, not a myth, not a metaphor, a witness. Yet history remembers her as less, a repentant sinner, a footnote to the resurrection, an afterthought. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if Mary's voice was silenced not by time, but by design? The Gospel of Mary, not the one in your Bible, not read from the pulpit, but real, found in the sands of Egypt in the 19th century, preserved in the shadows of forgotten caves, a gospel bearing her name, where she speaks, where she teaches, where she comforts the disciples when they are afraid. She speaks not just as a witness, but as a guide, a leader, chosen, and it doesn't stand alone. There are other gospels too, Thomas, Philip, Judas, each offering glimpses of a version of Christ less about obedience, more about awakening. In these texts, the kingdom isn't above, it's within, and Mary, she isn't a follower, she's central, respected, even envied by the others. Peter, in one passage, questions her, challenges her, says, "Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge?" And Levi replies, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are we to reject her?" But these words never made it into the canon. The Church in its earliest councils chose the four Gospels we now know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the others, the ones that painted a broader, deeper, more human story, were branded heresy, lost, buried, burned. Mary's Gospel was not lost to time, it was removed from time. The ex-priest said the Church feared her voice because it spoke of direct connection, a spirituality that bypassed hierarchy, a relationship with the divine that didn't need confessionals or intermediaries or altars. That kind of message could unravel the very structure that gave the Church its power. So Mary became the penitent, the weeping figure in stained glass, not the teacher, not the apostle, not the one he may have loved most. And the gospel that bears her name still rests in fragments, torn pages, missing lines, an incomplete memory that still refuses to be forgotten. Because her voice, once erased, still echoes, not with bitterness, but with truth, truth that was feared, not because it was false, but because it was free. And the greatest threat to any authority is a woman who remembers what she was never supposed to forget. It began in a quiet field in Portugal, a patch of earth no different from any other, until the sky opened. 3 children, barefoot, uneducated, tending sheep. And then a figure clothed in light. She called herself the Lady of the Rosary. But the world would come to know her as the Virgin of Fatima. She appeared not once, but 6 times, always in the same place, always with a message. Crowds gathered, thousands, tens of thousands. Even skeptics came, drawn by rumours of a miracle. And on October 13th, 1917, they say the sun danced. Witnesses claimed it spun in the sky, cast rainbows across the clouds, zigzagged toward the earth before returning to its throne. But the light show wasn't the only thing left behind. The children said she gave them secrets. 3, 2 were revealed. The first, a vision of hell, fire, demons, souls in torment, a warning, raw and vivid. The second, a prophecy of war, a prediction of World War II before it ever began. But the third, that's where the silence begins. Lucia, the eldest, was told to write it down. She sealed it in an envelope and delivered it to the Vatican with strict instructions. Do not open until 1960, or until the Church deemed the world ready. 1960 came and passed. No announcement, no release, just rumours, whispers, and finally, decades later, a version. The Vatican published a text, a vision of a bishop in white, walking through a ruined city, gunned down with others in an eerie allegory of martyrdom. They said this was the third secret, but many didn't believe it. Even high-ranking clergy hinted at more, a missing message, a warning too devastating to speak aloud. Some claimed the true secret concerned a crisis of faith within the church itself. Others said it revealed a coming apostasy, a future where the shepherds would betray the flock, and still others went further. They believed it foretold a spiritual deception so great, so complete, that it would come from within. The ex-priest said he once saw a classified file marked simply Fatima, restricted. No details, no access, but the existence of the label was enough. He said the church keeps some prophecies not to protect us, but to protect itself. Because a message that challenges authority, that questions purity, that dares to suggest the rot is within the walls, that kind of message cannot be canonized. It can only be contained. And so the third secret of Fatima remains a ghost, half spoken, half denied, forever hovering between the light and the vault, waiting for someone to ask the question they were told not to ask. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some happen in silence, in darkened rooms, with whispers, with screams, and prayers spoken like weapons. The church calls it a rite, an ancient one, a solemn ritual meant to cast out darkness. Not metaphorical, but personal, possessing, real. Exorcism. It sounds medieval, like something from another age, but the Vatican never stopped. To this day, it trains priests for the task, selects them carefully, teaches them rituals most will never speak of again. They're not sent to villages, they're sent to homes, hospitals, sometimes even churches, because the phenomenon hasn't disappeared, it's simply gone quiet, private, classified. There is no public directory of exorcists, no hotline. Requests are filtered through diocesan offices, evaluated, screened, and then sometimes approved. The ex-priest said he was never an exorcist himself, but he witnessed one, once. He described a girl barely 16, restrained but not struggling, calm at first, then cold, not the room, her voice. He said it changed, dropped, spoke in Latin she could not have known, named things no one in the room had said aloud. Objects shifted, the walls pulsed, and then silence. Not peace, not resolution, just a pause. He left the room shaken, not because he was afraid of the girl, but of what the church had known for centuries. That evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it whispers. The Vatican keeps records, hundreds, thousands. Most will never be seen. Filed under pseudonyms, marked with coded classifications, some cases verified, others left unresolved. They are not released to the press. They are not studied in seminaries. They are kept because to reveal them would be to admit something the modern world isn't prepared to accept. That possession is not just a relic of superstition, that something watches, listens, waits. Not all cases are true. The church is careful. It requires psychological evaluation, medical review. But still, some cases pass all tests, and when they do, priests are sent with crosses, holy water, and prayers older than language. They don't go to save the body, they go to retrieve the soul. The rite hasn't changed much in centuries, because whatever it is they're facing hasn't changed either. The exorcist does not seek fame, he seeks resolution, closure. But sometimes he leaves with more questions than answers, and those questions are written down, filed away, locked in drawers beneath marble halls, not to protect the public, but to protect belief. Because if the world knew what some priests have seen, it wouldn't just change faith, it would change reality. For centuries, the path to sainthood was not a celebration. It was a trial, a reckoning, a test of legacy, not just of holiness. And at the heart of that process stood a figure few understood, and even fewer welcomed, the devil's advocate. That was his name, his official title, Advocatus Diaboli. He wasn't there to oppose the church, He was part of it, a priest, a scholar, tasked with doing what no one else would, challenge the saint. He would dig, question, unearth every flaw, every contradiction, every shadow behind the light, not to destroy but to test, to prove the candidate's virtue not in legend but in scrutiny. It was a sacred role, a necessary one, a voice of reason in a sea of reverence. But then in 1983 the role vanished, quietly, without much explanation. The Vatican revised the canonization process, made it more pastoral, more merciful. They called it reform, modernization. But the ex-priest saw it differently. He said it was not mercy, but control. Because saints shape theology, they shape devotion, they become icons through which the church speaks, and questioning them means questioning the church's discernment. So the devil's advocate was removed, and in his absence the number of saints soared, canonizations increased, beatifications multiplied. More saints were named in a few decades than in the previous several centuries combined. The process became less adversarial, less investigative, more ceremonial, more political, because saints, the ex-priest said, aren't just holy, they're useful. They inspire, they unify, they drive pilgrimage, devotion, donations. And when there is no one left to question their past, who's to say what is real and what is myth? The devil's advocate once kept the church honest, grounded. He reminded them that light without shadow is not truth, but illusion. Now that voice is gone, and the saints, they ascend with ease, stories polished, doubts omitted, legacies crafted not through contradiction but celebration. And so the faithful kneel, pray, trust, not knowing that once upon a time someone stood to ask the hard questions, someone who dared to say not yet, not fully, not until we're sure. The church doesn't speak of him now, his office dissolved, his desk abandoned. But somewhere in the memory of parchment and ritual his voice still echoes, a final whisper, not of rebellion but of caution, because when no one plays the adversary everyone becomes a believer, and without the devil's advocate even heaven can be fooled. The word inquisition conjures flames, chains, confessions extracted in the dark, whispers turned into accusations, faith turned into fear. We imagine it as something buried, a relic of medieval cruelty, a chapter long since closed. But what if it never truly ended? What if it only changed names? In 1542, the Roman Inquisition was created to root out heresy from within, to silence the questions that echoed too loudly in church halls. It investigated thinkers, writers, priests, anyone whose ideas wandered too far from the approved path. It condemned Galileo, it silenced reformers. It kept the boundaries of belief narrow, unshakable, sealed. But in 1908, it changed, rebranded, modernized. They called it the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. No more dungeons, no more public burnings. Now, quiet corridors, private meetings, documents stamped confidential. And in 1981, a man named Joseph Ratzinger took control. He would later become Pope Benedict XVI. But before that, he ran the Vatican's watchdog office. He reviewed theologies, questioned movements, determined which voices would be heard and which would not. The ex-priest said you never heard from them until they had already decided. No trials, no defense, just a letter, a directive, a silencing. The congregation monitors books, speeches, academic papers. It watches for deviations. It listens for innovation that crosses into insubordination. It still exists today. It still has the authority to discipline theologians, to strip priests of their ministries, to censor. But now it does so behind closed doors, in the name of unity, doctrine, preservation. Some say this is necessary, that belief needs boundaries, that the church cannot function without a center. But others see something else, a quiet inquisition with no need for fire, just paperwork, just silence. Ideas don't need to be burned to disappear, they only need to be discredited, ignored, left to wither without platform or protection. And those who once stood on the edges, those who asked what if or why not, find themselves alone. The ex-priest said he once received such a letter, not harsh, not dramatic, just final, a warning that his work was under review, that certain interpretations were inconsistent with doctrine. He was advised to reflect, to reconsider, to conform. He didn't, and that was the end of his career. No trial, no flame, just a door that would never open again. So yes, the Inquisition has changed. It no longer needs chains, only a signature, a file, and a decision made in a room you will never see, because faith, when guarded too tightly, becomes control. And control, no matter how holy it seems, still casts a shadow. Beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the domes and incense, beneath centuries of prayer and proclamation, something rests in the dark. Bones, not on display, not in a glass case, but deep in the earth, sealed in silence. The Church says they belong to St. Peter, the first bishop of Rome, the rock upon which the Church was built. But how do we know? How can we be sure? The story is well told. Peter, crucified upside down under Emperor Nero, buried hastily in the necropolis on Vatican Hill. Over time, a shrine was built, then a chapel, then a basilica, layer upon layer of belief, of stone, of power. In the 1940s, excavations began, quietly. The Church didn't announce it. They dug beneath the altar, searching for proof of the foundation they claimed. And they found bones, fragments, a partial skeleton, wrapped in purple cloth and buried in a niche lined with rare marble. They said it was him, but the evidence is murky. There's no inscription, no name, no clear marker. Carbon dating was never made public, the bones weren't complete, and DNA was never tested, or at least never shared. Still, in 1968, Pope Paul VI declared they were authentic, Peter's relics. The fisherman turned apostle, now sealed beneath the grandest altar in Christendom. The ex-priest said he once stood near that spot. He didn't kneel, he didn't pray, he listened. Because relics, he said, are about more than history. They are about certainty, physical proof to anchor faith in the flesh, a skull in a reliquary, a femur behind glass, a drop of blood in a vial lit by candlelight. These things give shape to story, make belief tangible. But what if the relics are wrong? What if they're symbols, not remains? Would the structure begin to tremble? Because if the rock isn't Peter, what then is the Church built upon? The ex-priest didn't claim the bones were fake, he claimed it didn't matter, because belief wants certainty, wants something to touch, to stand on, to protect against doubt, and the bones, whether his or not, offer that illusion, a quiet promise buried in the soil. But when relics become foundations, truth becomes fragile, and faith, instead of leaping, begins to lean on things that decay, stone chips, ribbons of cloth, bones turned into anchors. So the question remains, are they his? Or are they the Church's way of saying, yes, this happened, yes, we were right, yes, believe? Sometimes the most powerful relics aren't the ones that prove something, but the ones that keep you from asking what needs to be proven at all. Not all treasures in the Vatican are locked in vaults of faith. Some are numbered, signed, moved in silence across continents. They call it the Institute for the Works of Religion, but most know it by a simpler name, the Vatican Bank, a place where gold meets God, where billions pass through marble corridors in the name of divine mission. But behind the ornate doors, behind the crucifixes and ledgers, there's a history few dare to follow. The Vatican Bank was created to fund good, charity, evangelization, service, but money does not stay clean. Not when it flows through so many hands, not when it moves in the dark. Over the years, questions began to rise. Untraceable accounts, offshore transfers, deals made with shadows wearing suits instead of robes. In the 1980s, a storm broke. A banker named Roberto Calvi, nicknamed God's Banker, was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, a rope around his neck, bricks in his pockets. His death was ruled a suicide, then a murder, then a mystery that remains unsolved. He was connected to Banco Ambrosiano, a financial institution tied to the Vatican Bank through secret channels and paper trails that vanished just when answers were needed. Billions disappeared, investors were ruined, and the church, when pressed, said very little. They paid a settlement, but offered no confessions, no real explanation. The ex-priest said the bank is a gate not just for funds, but for influence. Nations have moved money through it. Politicians have sought its favor. Even intelligence agencies, he claimed, used it to send quiet support to causes cloaked in righteousness. It's not about gold bars, it's about leverage, control. And when questioned, the church reminds the world this is a sovereign institution, a state, an entity with its own laws, its own rules. The Vatican Bank answers to no one except the Pope, and popes, for all their robes, are still human. In 2013, Pope Francis vowed to clean it up, to bring transparency, to reform the broken system. He made progress, closed suspicious accounts, fired powerful insiders. But even he, with all his authority, couldn't erase the past, or change the architecture of secrecy that had grown over decades. The truth. No one truly knows how much money moves through the Vatican, or where it all ends up. Charity? Maybe. But power has a price, and sometimes the holiest hands carry the heaviest ledgers. So when we speak of salvation, of grace, of eternity, we should also ask who's counting, and what's being counted. Because where gold flows without light, faith becomes a currency, and souls, whether saved or not, can still be bought. He was known as the smiling Pope, gentle, humble, a shepherd's heart in a statesman's chair. Pope John Paul I, elected in 1978, a breath of fresh air, a man who walked softly through marble halls and spoke not of power, but of service. 33 days later he was dead. No illness announced, no warning, no drama, just gone, found in his chambers, alone, a book still open beside him, glasses resting where his eyes would never return. They said it was a heart attack, a peaceful death, a natural one. But no autopsy was performed, not by request, not by law, just not done. And in that space, silence rushed in. The Vatican released no medical report, no doctor's signature, no timeline of his final moments, just a statement, brief, final. But questions did not fade, they multiplied. Why no autopsy? Why were his personal belongings removed so quickly? Why were statements from Vatican officials so inconsistent, so rehearsed, so hesitant? He had spoken of changes, deep ones, of financial reform, of investigating corruption within the Vatican Bank. He'd hinted at naming new bishops, at reviewing the structure of power, at simplifying the throne. He didn't want to reign, he wanted to serve. But change is dangerous, especially in a city built on tradition, on hierarchy, on centuries of silent control. The ex-priest said there were rumors even before the funeral, that he had written names, made lists, that he was preparing to clean house, and some didn't want to be swept out. He was buried quickly, with dignity but without examination, and then forgotten, overshadowed by the long and historic reign of his successor, John Paul II. But 33 days lingers like a question without a question mark, the shortest papacy in modern history, long enough to be noticed, too short to be understood. There are books, documentaries, speculations that wander into the realm of conspiracy, but even without proof, even without accusations, the absence of transparency remains its own kind of truth. Because when a voice is silenced that quickly, the echo never really stops. The church denies foul play, always has, but denials are not answers, and faith, when coupled with silence, breeds mystery, and mystery left long enough becomes doubt. So today, his portrait still hangs, smiling, gentle, gone. And the faithful still wonder what might have been if 33 days had become 30 years, if a different kind of church had been allowed to emerge, or if, once again, the light was extinguished just before it could spread. High in the Arizona desert, where the air is dry and the stars burn clear, there sits a telescope with a name that doesn't belong. Lucifer, not a nickname, not a rumor. An actual instrument, part of a larger observatory just miles from Vatican-supported research. And the name? That's where things get strange, because Lucifer wasn't chosen by theologians but by scientists. Originally an acronym, a technical title that stands for infrared technology, but still, Lucifer, the light bringer, the fallen star, the name that echoes through every exorcism, every warning, every pulpit-thundered sermon, and it watches the heavens, just like the Vatican's own telescope nearby. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, or VATT. Why would the Church or those connected to it fund and support a facility beside something bearing such a name? Coincidence? Maybe, but coincidence rarely feels this deliberate. The ex-priest said the Church has long had a quiet interest in the sky, not just stars, but patterns, events, possibilities. He believed the telescopes aren't just for scientific observation, but for anticipation, a search not for creation, but for disruption. Comets, asteroids, signals, and maybe something more. Because deep within ancient texts there are references to watchers, messengers, entities from above, neither divine nor demonic, but something in between. The Book of Enoch, the Apocrypha, the old scrolls hidden from canon. They speak of stars that move on their own, of knowledge given too early, of beings that descend and awaken. What if the Church is still watching for them? And what if the name Lucifer is more than irony, but a signal? A reference to the old light, the forbidden illumination, the knowledge once cast down. The observatory scans the skies in infrared, the unseen spectrum, heat, movement, traces left behind by things we cannot see with human eyes. It's not just astronomy, it's pursuit. The Church says it embraces science, that it welcomes exploration, but it also guards secrets. And some believe those two truths are not separate, but intertwined. The telescopes may be pointed outward, but the real gaze is inward, toward prophecy, toward fulfillment, toward a moment that hasn't arrived, but is always approaching. The stars hold time, the sky is memory, and somewhere among the constellations they believe a message waits. Lucifer, the name burned into stone in circuit, and behind it a quiet question. What are they really looking for? And when they find it, will we even be told? Or will the sky's secret join all the others hidden beneath robes, behind locks, and inside walls built not to protect us, but to prepare for something still unnamed? There are shadows even the Church cannot outrun. Not ancient ones, not theological puzzles, but wounds, raw, human, and still bleeding. Children, silenced, hurt, left with questions no priest would ever answer. For decades it was whispered. A rumor here, an accusation there, quickly dismissed, brushed away like ash from the hem of a robe. But ash builds and eventually it chokes. The abuse scandals didn't start in the 2000s. They started long before. In villages, in sacristies, in homes where trust was turned into a weapon. And the Vatican knew. Not in the way governments know with files and briefings, but in the way institutions know when silence is louder than truth. Letters were written, complaints sent, victims begged to be heard. Some priests were moved, not punished, just relocated, from one parish to another, from one country to the next, always with a promise: don't speak, handle it quietly, for the good of the Church. But the good of the Church was measured in reputation, not in healing, and so the silence grew, institutionalized, refined, taught. Bishops learned to file reports that went nowhere, to use words like inappropriate behavior instead of the truth. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith received the most serious cases, and still, so many disappeared. The ex-priest said he found one of those letters once, buried in a drawer unsigned but stained with something heavier than ink. He said the hardest part was not the horror, but the apathy. No outrage, no urgency, just procedure. When the truth began to break, Boston, Ireland, Australia, it didn't fall like thunder, it seeped. One voice, then another, then hundreds, then thousands, and still, the Vatican moved slowly. Apologies came. But accountability rarely followed. Money was paid, files were sealed, priests were defrocked but rarely imprisoned, because the greater fear was not justice, but exposure, and what exposure might mean for the entire structure, because if one lie lived in the foundation, what else might be buried there? So they spun a new story, of healing, of reform, of safeguards and commissions, and yet so many of the men who enabled it remain untouched. The Church says it grieves with the victims, but grief without truth is just performance, and performance cannot heal. What was buried was not just sin, it was knowledge, of who knew and when, and who decided that silence was holier than justice. There are sins too great for confession, and some altars built on bones that still wait to be acknowledged, not for retribution, but for truth, because only truth can cast out a shadow this deep. For centuries the Church told us we were alone, that earth was the center, that humanity was the crown of creation, that the stars were simply the ceiling above our sacred story. But the stars kept whispering, and eventually even the Vatican began to listen. In recent decades the Church has spoken openly, carefully, deliberately, about the possibility of extraterrestrial life, not to dismiss it, but to make room for it. In 2008, Father José Gabriel Funes, then the head of the Vatican Observatory, made headlines. He said believing in aliens does not contradict faith, that the universe is vast, perhaps teeming with life, and that creation in all its mystery is not bound to just one world. He even called them our brothers, not enemies, not intruders, but fellow children of the same Creator. The message was simple but profound. God is bigger than earth. But why now? Why start speaking publicly after so many centuries of silence? The ex-priest said this was no spontaneous shift. He believed the Vatican has been preparing, quietly, methodically, for a truth that can no longer be ignored. He claimed internal discussions have gone far deeper than what's been released. Theological papers that ask hard questions. What happens to original sin if another species never fell? What if they never needed redemption? What if they never crucified their Saviour? Would they need one at all? Would we? These questions aren't just academic, they shake the foundations of salvation as we've known it, and the Church knows it. Why fund observatories? Why partner with astronomers? Why study exoplanets and cosmic signatures with such quiet urgency? The answer may not be belief, but anticipation, of discovery, of contact, of a revelation that changes the narrative not just of science, but of Scripture. Some say the Church has already seen what the world has not, that artifacts, records, or testimonies have passed through Vatican hands long before they ever reach the public, that some of those secrets are sealed in the same vaults that hold forgotten gospels and forbidden names. The Vatican may not know the whole truth, but it is watching, listening, preparing. Because when the sky speaks, and it will, people will turn not just to scientists, but to priests, to pastors, to those who have always claimed to speak for the divine, and the Church will be ready, with a message crafted not in panic but in patience, because sometimes faith doesn't resist the unknown, it absorbs it. And when the stars finally reveal that we were never alone, those who spent lifetimes guarding the truth will be the first to welcome it, or to tell us what to believe about it. It wasn't left on a pulpit, it wasn't read from an altar, it was found in a drawer, sealed, folded 3 times. No return address, no name, just a cross, hand-drawn in ink, faint at the corners where age had begun to eat the paper. A final letter, written by the ex-priest who once spoke, then vanished. He hadn't preached in years, hadn't stepped inside a church since the day he walked away, or was pushed, or both. But before he died, he left something behind. Not a doctrine, not a sermon, but a whisper meant for the few who might understand. The letter was brief, 4 pages, not angry, not bitter, almost calm, as if what he carried had long since ceased to be a burden, and had become simply truth. He spoke of secrets not as conspiracies, but as currency, of faith used like scaffolding, meant to build something higher, then quietly removed once the structure could stand on its own. He wrote of archives beneath the basilica, of knowledge that could not be destroyed without destroying belief itself. He did not name names, he didn't need to. He wrote of rituals that kept memory alive, not just sacred memory, but human, ancient, pre-church. He said the church was not the source of truth, but its vault, and that over time those who held the keys forgot what was inside, all feared it, and locked the door a little tighter every century. He wrote of Mary, of the stars, of voices beneath the Vatican that sang in languages no one speaks aloud anymore. And in his final paragraph he offered no revelation, no great reveal, just a question. What if faith was never about believing? He underlined it. What if it was always about remembering what you were never allowed to know? No signature, no farewell, just a small piece of parchment taped to the bottom of the final page, a fragment of Latin, faded, barely legible. Translated loosely, it read, "The light was never hidden, only your eyes were closed." The letter made its way into quiet hands, not filed, not forgotten, kept, protected, because there are some messages too soft for microphones, too raw for scripture, and too sacred to be heard before the listener is ready. A dying man's truth is not always confession. Sometimes it's initiation into something deeper, older, quieter, and once heard, it never fully leaves you. Not everything the church believes is written in gold letters on white pages. Some truths, if they can be called that, are guarded, not preached, stored, not shared. There is a term for it. Disciplina arcani, the discipline of the secret, an ancient practice older than papal robes and cathedral bells. In the early centuries, it meant certain teachings were withheld from the unbaptized, not out of cruelty, but out of caution. Mysteries of the Eucharist, the meaning of the sacraments. Even the Lord's Prayer was once taught in whispers. Because truth, they said, must be protected. Too much light too soon could blind. So the church built a system, a sacred silence, a rule within the rule. What could be spoken from the pulpit was one thing. What was preserved behind stone walls was another. And over time that principle hardened, not just to guard the mysteries, but to control them, not just to protect the sacred, but to decide who gets to define it. The ex-priest said the doctrine of secrecy was never just about the content. It was about the hierarchy of knowing. Who has access, who doesn't, and why. He said some knowledge was restricted not because it was false, but because it was too true, too destabilizing, too uncontainable. So the church preserved it, not in glass cases, but in classification. Documents marked non-divulgare, not to be disclosed. Archives segmented, scrolls misfiled on purpose, footnotes that lead nowhere. And if someone asked the wrong question, they were told it wasn't the time. Or worse, that asking itself was an error of pride. Holy secrecy became a shield and a weapon. Because if a mystery is never explained, it can mean whatever the speaker says it means. And if only a few are allowed to see, they become the keepers of meaning, the interpreters, the gatekeepers. Faith became layered. For the masses, symbols, stories, comfort. For the initiates, nuance, contradictions, power. And those two worlds rarely touched. The ex-priest believed there were teachings still buried, not just in parchment, but in liturgy, in language, in ritual gestures whose meanings have long since been forgotten by the people who perform them. And he asked, if the sacred is truly universal, why must it be hidden? If the divine is love, why must it be coded? And if salvation is for all, why must truth be for the few? But questions are dangerous in a system built on certainty. So the answers remain cloaked, in Latin, in silence, in doors that don't just close, they never opened. Because in the end, the doctrine of secrecy isn't about protecting faith, it's about deciding who gets to shape it. The bells toll. The white smoke rises. A name is announced. A pope has been chosen. A new era begins. But what about the time in between? The days between death and coronation? Between the last breath of one pontiff and the first blessing of the next? They call it sede vacante, the vacant seat. a symbolic emptiness, a pause in the heartbeat of the world's oldest monarchy. But the question whispers louder than the ritual allows. Is the seat ever truly empty? Or is the successor already waiting before the old one is even buried? The Vatican is a machine, an ancient one, quiet, polished, unrelenting. And like any machine, it does not stop, even when the figure at the front is gone. The College of Cardinals meets, they pray, they vote, but decisions, the real ones, are often made long before the ballots are burned. The ex-priest said the conclave is theatre, holy, yes, symbolic, yes, but not without script. He claimed the names are already whispered in corridors, that alliances form in silence, in smiles exchanged years before robes are folded away. That succession is not born in prayer, but in planning, because the Church cannot afford chaos. Not when it governs over 1 billion souls, not when its vaults hold centuries of treasure, secrets and stability. And sometimes, he said, the one who rises was groomed for it. Not by fate, but by hand, a loyal bishop, a strategic cardinal, a voice that echoes the right convictions while hiding the right doubts. The throne may appear empty, but it never loses gravity. Power clings to it, draws toward it, arranges itself around it like planets circling a sun they cannot touch. And even when a pope abdicates, as Benedict XVI did, and lives still within the Vatican walls, the illusion of vacancy is managed with care, because two popes, living, breathing, thinking, creates questions, and questions create cracks. So the Church smiles, moves forward, lets tradition speak, lets incense rise, and the world believes a new chapter has begun. But power never really changes hands. It shifts, repositions, reinvents. The seat may be empty for a moment, but the weight of it never lifts. And those who sit next are rarely surprised by the call. Because in this kingdom, waiting is a posture, a readiness. And sometimes the throne chooses long before the Church admits a choice was made. So the bells may toll, the smoke may rise, but the silence in between, that's where the real story is written. They were priests, confessors, diplomats, but they were also something else, observers, messengers, eyes and ears behind enemy lines. They didn't carry weapons, they carried rosaries, letters, and access. The Vatican, for all its sacred posture, has long operated as a state within a state, and like any state, it knows the value of information, of knowing, before others do. During the Cold War, while the world was split in two, the Vatican sat at the crossroads, not east, not west, but something in between. And it listened. It had diplomats in Moscow, whispers in Warsaw, connections that stretched from Cuba to Cairo, because priests go where governments cannot. They hear what officials never do. In confessions, in quiet conversations over wine, in the stories people share with those they trust. And the Church is built on trust. That trust became a pipeline, a network of soft surveillance long before modern intelligence agencies gave it a name. The ex-priest said some bishops acted like liaisons, others like handlers, not for politics, at least not directly, but for leverage. Because information, even when whispered in Latin, is power. Reports could be passed from parish to diocese, from diocese to Rome, typed, coded, translated, then filed away or quietly handed to someone wearing a collar and a diplomat's smile. Popes received intelligence briefings, sometimes before presidents did. The Vatican knew when walls would fall, when revolutions would rise, when leaders were vulnerable or corrupted, and in some cases they acted, not with armies, but with influence, helping to broker peace or to guide resistance, depending on what served the mission of the Church. But espionage doesn't fade with empires. Today the Vatican remains plugged in. Its Secretariat of State monitors world affairs. Its nunciatures, embassies in all but name, report quietly from every corner of the globe. Some say Vatican intelligence has even crossed into digital realms, cyber surveillance, encrypted communication, not to control, but to stay ahead. Because even in a world of satellites and drones, nothing replaces the whispered truth shared with a priest. The ex-priest believed some orders, Jesuits especially, had members trained not just in theology, but in analysis, in counterintelligence, in discretion so complete it disappears. They are not spies in the traditional sense. They are shepherds with eyes open, and when truth travels through pulpits and pews, through letters and Latin, it arrives in Rome long before the headlines do. So the question isn't whether the Vatican spies, it's how much it already knows, and how often it has chosen to act, or not. In a game of power, it's not always about what you say, it's about what you never have to. Language is more than words. It's rhythm, it's spell, it's a structure that holds power even when the meaning is lost. And for the Vatican, language has always been the first gate, Latin, a tongue no longer spoken in streets, yet still alive in the Church's breath. Not conversational, not casual, sacred, sealed, deliberately opaque. For centuries, Mass was spoken in Latin. Prayers were recited, heard, repeated, but not always understood. And that wasn't a flaw. It was design. The ex-priest once said that Latin doesn't just preserve meaning, it controls it. It creates distance, reverence, a feeling that what's being said is too holy to fully grasp. And in that gap between sound and sense, power blooms. Because when language becomes ritual, it no longer needs to explain, it commands. And the faithful accept it. They don't translate, they trust. But it goes deeper than words. Look at the symbols, the vestments, the incense that curls through cathedrals like a forgotten alphabet in smoke. Each motion has meaning, each object is a code, gold thread woven into robes, 3 fingers raised during a blessing, a candle extinguished at a precise moment. These aren't accidents, they're layers, each layer building on the last, until the ritual speaks not to the ears, but to something older, subconscious, spiritual, instinctive. It is a language of control hidden in plain sight, a language that teaches without explaining, that imprints itself on the soul without ever needing permission. Children grow up under these signs. They don't ask what the symbols mean, they absorb them, repeat them, pass them on, until belief feels less like a choice and more like the air they were raised to breathe. The Church knows this. It's why symbols rarely change, why rituals are defended more fiercely than even doctrine, because symbols are memory. And memory is harder to argue with than theology. The ex-priest believed that this symbolic system was never just about preserving the sacred, it was about preserving structure, hierarchy, authority, obedience wrapped in lace and Latin, not to deceive, but to shape, because when meaning is layered, only the few can peel it back. And those who can't, they follow, they nod, they kneel, not because they understand, but because they feel they're supposed to. And in that silent agreement, control is complete. So when we hear the chants, see the gestures, smell the incense, we're not just witnessing ceremony. We're experiencing a language that was never meant to be translated, only obeyed. The Vatican does not forget. It remembers everything, but not all at once, not openly, and never without purpose. It holds the memory of kings and killers, of heresies burned and heretics canonized, of truths once feared, then welcomed, then quietly filed away again. Because remembering in the Church is not an act of nostalgia, it's a tool, a decision, a strategy wrapped in liturgy. The ex-priest used to say the Church does not operate on time, it operates on timing. And memory? That's currency. There are archives beneath Rome where light has not touched a single page in centuries, locked drawers, untranslated scrolls, shelves upon shelves of events too dangerous to forget and too dangerous to reveal. It's not about hiding everything, it's about choosing when the world is ready or when it needs to be reminded. A condemned theologian becomes a saint 300 years later. A once suppressed idea returns with a new name and a different robe, and suddenly it was never gone, just waiting. The Vatican remembers timelines that governments have lost. It knows which calendars were adjusted, which histories rewritten, which relics moved, not for reverence, but for politics. Because the Church was never just a spiritual body, it was and still is a keeper of chronology. And in a world ruled by information, nothing is more powerful than the ability to curate the past. What it elevates becomes sacred, what it omits becomes irrelevant. and what it remembers at just the right moment can shift faith or restore control. Some believe there are gospels still in its possession, ones with names the world was never meant to know, maps, correspondence, secrets of saints whose stories were too wild to be taught. And then there are the books written by outsiders, collected quietly, reviewed in secret, never banned but never acknowledged. The ex-priest claimed even ideas have their holding cell. Some are kept not because they're false, but because they're too close to something true, too soon, too loud, too uncontrollable. So the church holds them until they fit, or until no one's listening anymore, because silence is not forgetting, it's preservation. And when the Vatican finally chooses to speak about aliens or hidden saints or relics rediscovered, it would do so not as a surprise, but as if the memory was always known, because it was, just not to you. So ask not what the Vatican has forgotten, ask what it's still keeping, and what it's waiting for the perfect moment to remember out loud. Maybe it was never about hiding the darkness, maybe it was about hiding the light. The Vatican stands like a monument to divinity, marble and gold, domes that kiss the sky, pillars that hold more than architecture. They hold authority. But behind every veil of incense, behind every whispered prayer in Latin, there is a curtain, not of fabric, but of silence, a separation between what is taught and what is known, between the faithful and the few who decide what faith means. The ex-priest once said the church has never been afraid of sin. It was built on the idea that sin is inevitable, forgivable, manageable. But truth, raw, unfiltered truth, isn't manageable. It doesn't kneel. It doesn't follow order. Truth reveals. And revelation is chaos to a system built on control. So maybe the real fear isn't darkness, it's illumination. Because what happens when people see that the sacred was always within them? What happens when the rituals become mirrors? When the symbols start speaking a language you were never taught to hear? Not Latin, not doctrine, but the quiet voice that's been buried beneath robes, candles, hierarchies. The voice that says, you were never separate, you were never less, you don't need permission to seek the divine. That voice terrifies institutions, because it can't be licensed or taxed or silenced once it's heard. So the curtain remains, a veil of mystery, a theatre of shadows that keeps the faithful looking up, but not within. And yet, light always finds its cracks, in forgotten gospels, in strange stars, in the moments between ritual and realization. The light is not loud, it doesn't knock down doors, it waits, softly, patiently, for someone to stop repeating and start remembering. The ex-priest's final words weren't a warning, they were a gift, a reminder that belief should never be inherited, it should be encountered. That questions are not betrayals, they are invitations. That the divine does not live only in cathedrals or in pages sealed by councils, it lives in wonder, and wonder has no master. So maybe the Vatican doesn't fear darkness at all, maybe it learned to use it, to create the illusion that light is rare and access to it must be earned. But the truth? The light was never theirs to give, and never yours to earn. It was always there, behind the curtain, waiting for the moment you realized. You didn't need anyone to pull it back. If something in you stirred, if a voice inside whispered, I always wondered about that, then you're not alone. You were never alone. Because across the world in quiet rooms behind glowing screens there are others, just like you. People who aren't content with the official story. People who feel the tug of something deeper, older, just beneath the surface of what we're told to believe. People who suspect that history isn't just written, it's curated, and that some truths aren't lost, they're locked. If this journey made you pause, made you feel something you can't explain, a chill, a curiosity, a strange comfort in the unknown, then we invite you to stay, to subscribe. Not just to this channel, but to this pursuit, this community, this quiet rebellion of asking the questions they never wanted us to ask. Because what we're doing here isn't entertainment, it's remembrance. The kind that happens not with facts, but with feeling, with pattern recognition, with ancient intuition waking up inside you. So hit that like button if the light came on even just a little, if something you heard clicked, resonated, made the past feel eerily close. Comment below. Not to argue, but to share. What part of this story echoed in your bones? What question won't leave you alone now? What memory feels like it doesn't belong to you, but somehow does? And most of all, share this video with a friend, with someone who's been searching too, someone who sits in silence wondering why the world feels off, not broken, but obscured, staged. Because the more we remember together, the harder it becomes to keep anything hidden. The truth doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it waits, but it also spreads. Quietly, like fire beneath the ash. And you, by watching, by questioning, by continuing, you are part of that flame. So don't stop here. We have so many more stories to tell, so many veils to lift, so many lights still waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Because the darkness isn't eternal, it's just carefully maintained. And the moment we see through it, even for a second, we become something more than observers. We become rememberers. So stay curious, stay open, stay awake, and we'll meet you in the next chapter, right where the silence ends.